Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Ultimate Guide to Getting Started in Your Divorce. We will give about a minute of time for people to join. And in the meantime, we want to thank everyone who has taken time out of their day to attend this webinar. We know how overwhelming the divorce process can be. Our aim with this webinar is to give you the education and guidance that you'll need to feel more prepared in your divorce and to try to reduce that amount of overwhelm. Okay, I see some people joining. Welcome, everyone. We will get started. We have a ton of content to review, and I want to make sure we have enough time to do it justice. I will start by introducing myself. I am the head of marketing at divorce.com. I'm here all the time for our webinars and helping to get content to all of you to get educated in the divorce process. And then divorce.com, we are pioneering modern divorce by reducing the time, cost, uncertainty, and unnecessary trauma of the typical divorce process. We have an all-in-one platform designed to streamline your divorce journey. We offer comprehensive services with expert guidance, easy-to-use resources, automated paperwork generation, mediation sessions, and filing assistance with the court. And ultimately, we're here to help you through this entire process. Part of what we want to do today is make sure that you are educated and feel confident. And so before we get started, we have some housekeeping that we want to make sure you know how to interact with us during this webinar to get the most out of it. The first thing is understanding that we will be accepting some questions in the Q&A section below. So please, as you're hearing different information and have questions, drop your questions into that Q&A section. We will reserve some time at the end to make sure we address some of them. A note on how to approach the questions. We cannot give legal advice, so if you can, try to be more general in your question asking and not make it very specific about your unique case, because we will not be able to answer anything that's legal advice. The other piece of housekeeping, we will have the chat open for us to share resources. Part of what we want to do in this educational review today is give you access to as many resources as possible. So there might be some homework after the webinar for you to either research some things, read things, watch things, or even interact with some tools. So we'll be putting that in the chat section. We'll also be sharing it after the webinar. So rest assured, if you accidentally miss a resource that you're really interested, don't worry, we will get it via email after the fact, along with the recording of this webinar. But if you are interested in following along during the session, you can just check the chat. And then finally, the last bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We're really interested in understanding where you are in this process. So we'll be sending through a poll to ask basically how far along you are, if this webinar is your starting point, if you have already done some research, but you're still unsure what to do next, or maybe you have got a good sense of what this process looks like, but you have a few questions about how and what those next steps should be, or maybe you're ready to file and you just want to make sure that you're not missing anything with one last piece of education. So put your response in. This will help us understand, at least for those of you who are in attendance, where you are in this journey. Okay, it looks like a fair bit of you are very early on in the process, with most of you having completed some research, but you're still unsure. I would say the majority of the content today should help address what to do next. And for those of you who are ready to file, we'll also address how you can move forward if you're at that phase as well. Okay. To get started, part of what we'll be doing today is really walking you through different considerations and different phases of research and preparation. But before we do that, we wanted to zoom out and just give you a very brief overview of the divorce process itself. This is important to understand because the process can look different depending on if you pursue an uncontested divorce, which means you reach an agreement with your spouse, or if you pursue a contested divorce, which means you plan to fight through the court system to reach that agreement and potentially let a judge decide. Why is this important? Well, it can, depending on which approach you take, determine how long this process takes, how much cost or expense is associated with the process, the level of certainty that you'll have with your outcome, and truly the stress and the trauma that comes along with it. We really advocate for people to try, at least when you're starting out, to pursue an uncontested divorce. That means you might not have agreement yet on certain aspects of your divorce with your spouse, but you're at least willing to try to work through that in a cooperative way, as opposed to fighting it through the court system, hiring lawyers, and going a route that can really be drug out and take a ton of time and potentially not even be meeting you with the right outcome, because if you let a judge decide, it's really up to them, and you lose some of that control. So this is important to understand. We're hoping that many of you who are in attendance today are going to be trying the more amicable approach, but just know that if that's not an option for you, that does have some implications for how you're going to be thinking about this process and the steps that you'll need to take. There's just more of them. Okay. Now, to really get tactical and dive into what we'll be discussing today, there's 6 key steps that we're going to cover, or considerations, in this earlier phase in preparing for your divorce. The first is how you involve your spouse when you do that, what that discussion looks like, some considerations about the level of cooperation, like I just discussed on the last slide, and trying to get a sense of how their involvement in this process will be, whether it's contentious or not. We'll also review the state laws and how they will potentially impact how you go about your divorce and what those guidance are by state. We'll then talk about gathering different documents. This is necessary to file the paperwork. It's also just good practice to get a sense of all the different aspects of your current circumstance so that you can prepare appropriately, and also, logistically speaking, have certain things on hand if you're in the process of moving or separating. Another aspect of this that we'll discuss is assessing your finances. This piece is usually a very important step for many people. We'll talk about how you should be thinking about your assets and debt, as well as your income and expenses. We have tools that we'll discuss, and how you can really start to play around with different options and thinking through what that division of property will look like, and just overall some best practices for approaching your financial well-being. And then for those of you who have children, we'll talk about key considerations for children in the divorce process. We'll cover things like, what custody types there are, what visitation schedules you should be considering, and how to put together a parenting plan. And then finally, sort of throughout this discussion, we'll talk about the concept of negotiation, but we want to leave some time near the end to just really give you some ideas for how to approach it, what mindset you should be coming into this process with, and then some of the key decisions that will be necessary in this process that likely will need or require some level of compromise and therefore negotiation. And then finally, we'll talk about what you do once you have all of the agreements in place and how you do documentation and filing. Okay, the first step that we'll review is that conversation with your spouse and getting them involved. Just based on the poll results, for those of you who are in attendance, it seems like some of you are, a little bit farther along than others. Sometimes people choose to have that discussion with their spouse first to initiate this process, and some choose to wait until later in the process once you've done some research and have a better sense of how to approach things. Regardless of where you're at, we do have some best practices for when you are ready to have that discussion with your spouse. Again, you should always be assessing this through the lens of how you think your spouse will be in terms of cooperation in this process and how much communication you have with them. The ideal scenario would be when you are ready to discuss this decision to get a divorce with your spouse, that you have plenty of time to talk. You want an environment that isn't going to be interrupted. It will be quiet. Both of you hopefully will be in a calm state of mind. No children around. Again, you don't want any interruptions, and you definitely don't want them overhearing this type of conversation. And you really don't want anything urgent or pressing that would be coming up that would ultimately affect the conversation and potentially require you to leave the conversation mid-discussion. The other piece of the puzzle in terms of this discussion with your divorce is how you actually talk about it. So we recommend getting right to the point, really not bringing up past grudges from the relationship, but ultimately just making it very clear that this is what you want, that you have thought long and hard about it, and ultimately this is what you have come to the conclusion on. Stay calm during that discussion. There will likely be some level of objection or at least some level of emotion. So be prepared for that and allow for some space for listening to how your spouse is reacting to this decision, and give them time to accept the decision. So sometimes people will want to dive right into, okay, what do we do? Do we hire lawyers? Do we think about filing? This is the wrong time. You should really just allow space for the discussion and the processing of the decision, and then do a follow-up conversation where you start to get more into the specifics of how you move forward. Okay. The next step in the getting started process is to understand your rights and your state laws. Divorce is a very state-specific or location-specific process. And so we want you to know upfront what aspects of divorce you should be really looking into on a state level to make sure you have the right expectations and you're properly prepared. So what are those things? The first one is to understand that separation and waiting periods can differ by state. Some states have these, some states don't. For those that do have separation periods, these are at the beginning of the divorce process. So putting some time and space when you're first separating in between when you ultimately file. And then a waiting period happens on the back half once you've filed with the court. Sometimes there's some amount of time that the court wants to see lapse between when you file and when the divorce decree is final. So you'll want to understand this up front so that you have clear expectations in terms of timing of the divorce. In some states, this can go much quicker. In other states, you might be waiting up to a year or more. And so you don't want to come in with the wrong expectation about how long this will take when that information is available. Speaking of which, we have a resource for you to be able to look up some of these guidelines by state. Not only will you be able to see the separation and waiting periods, you'll also get to see the residency requirements and grounds for divorce in that lookup. The residency requirements are important. This is going to determine where you file, so you'll need to understand both you and your spouse, how long you need to have lived in a certain state, and make sure that you're following that guidance from your state. Again, you can look it up in the tool that we're going to be sharing out in the chat. And again, we'll follow up with this after the fact, but very critical in understanding how you're going to be approaching the filing process. And again, if there's any kind of waiting period required for that. There's also grounds for divorce to be considering. You can effectively either file on a fault-based ground, so this could look like adultery or addiction, or a no-fault basis. This will depend on your state whether or not fault-based grounds are available, so you'll want to look that up and make sure you understand what is required if you're going to pursue fault-based grounds or not. And then finally, the division of property. This is really important when you're thinking about, okay, who gets the house and how do we think about dividing our bank accounts? Each state approaches this slightly differently. There's two main buckets. The majority of states follow an equitable division of property, which effectively means we're looking for fairness. So there's two people who are involved in a divorce, and Each person has some things that will make them feel like they're set up for success in their post-divorce life. Getting to a place where things are fair is what those types of states are really looking for when you're dividing things up. The other set of states has a community property guidelines, which is looking at marital assets that are accumulated during the marriage and trying to divide them equally. So depending on where you live, you'll have some slightly different guidance on how to be thinking about that division of property. So again, we are encouraging you to look that up in advance. We have a blog article that will share out as well in the chat that goes state by state and says which one's an equitable distribution state versus a community property, and then some further details about how you think about things in terms of the actual assets or debt that is available and what's considered marital property. So lots to consider here. Probably some more research needs to be done for those of you who are in attendance, and just really make sure you have as much preparation and understanding as you possibly can as you're coming into this process. The next step that we encourage is for you to gather your important documents. There are a lot of different documents that we suggest gathering. We have a very helpful checklist. It's pretty extensive in terms of how many documents it lists. If you are going to look at this checklist, do not be overwhelmed by it. We're trying to accommodate all different types of circumstances and lifestyles. And so not all of these will apply to you, but we would rather, over communicate than under communicate. Some of the type of information that we are really encouraging you to look for include your personal information, so things like your driver's license or your passport or social security card, marriage documentation, financial documents, so things like your tax returns for the past few years, or credit card statements or bank statements, any kind of property and asset documents. So if you've ever had anything of value valued in the past, anything around your mortgage, if you have it, making sure you have all of that documentation at hand. Also looking into insurance policies, any documents around business ownership, if that is something that is relevant to you. If you have children, anything related to that, their social security cards, for example, and any kind of legal documentation. If there was a prenup in place, for example, what that looks like, or other orders from past relationships. You'll want to make sure that you have this for two reasons. The first is a lot of this information that we're recommending you gather, or the documents rather, that information that's on the documents will be asked in the paperwork as you're going through the filing process. So it's just easy to have it gathered all at once. The other reason why we recommend this is we feel really strongly that it's important for you to, one, have it on hand, right? Because for some people, you'll be moving and you want to make sure you know where all this information is. It's very important. And then two, it's really helpful to just know and get a sense of the lay of the land of what your bank statements look like and what your past W-2 statements were, so that you can move into other steps that we'll get into later with as much preparation and as much information as you have at hand, so that you're making the right decisions as you think about different agreements with your spouse. Speaking of your finances, the next step in this process is to assess your finances. This is a pretty big step, a lot of pieces in here, and in terms of the time it takes to really do this step justice, there is some level of involvement and homework that I would say we encourage people to do. One of the first things you want to do, very similar to the documents gathering, is get a sense of all of your individual accounts and your shared accounts, and where necessary, start creating separate accounts. This is a best practice to make sure that you really start to create a history. One of the next steps that we suggest is doing a credit report, both during the divorce process and then even after the divorce process. It's a best practice to just keep an eye on that. And anytime you have shared accounts, there is a potential impact to credit. So you want to be thinking about that. Another big piece of the puzzle when you think about finances and all of the assets that you have, for most people, if you own a home, that is likely one of your largest assets. So knowing what to do and thinking through the options about what you do with your home is usually a big decision in this process, one that is both emotional as well as financial. We have done a webinar in the past where we had a lending professional come on and talk through different options and how to be considering whether you sell the home, you buy out your spouse, you continue to co-own, all those different options, and some other implications like tax considerations, for example. So we encourage you to watch that if this is a circumstance of yours where you have the home and you're not quite sure what to do with that home ownership. Another tool that we have and best practice that we recommend as you're evaluating your finances and trying to understand your financial well-being in this process is building a budget for yourself. So that will look at all of the income that you have coming in and then all of the expenses that are going out. And on a monthly basis, you can look at if you will have enough money to be able to support yourself. When you're going through that exercise, and we have a budget tracker for you to use and kind of play around and plug in your own numbers into when you're going through that exercise. If you, as part of this divorce process, are considering child support or alimony in the decree, you will want to either, if that's incoming to you or outgoing to your spouse, you'll want to also include that just so you have a full sense of the picture. Another very important aspect to this and what will be required when you're filling out some of your forms for the filing process is to get a sense of your assets and debt. So this could be, how much is the home valued at and what is the current mortgage left on the home. Other things are bank accounts, how much is in your savings account, your checkings account, how much your car is worth, and if you have any loans on that car. So things along that nature, documenting all of that information, and then assessing what it could look like as you decide how you're going to divide things. We have a tool that will allow you to kind of play with different scenarios. If you currently co-own something and it's 50-50, basically, and you want to take ownership of it, or you want to have your spouse take ownership of it after the fact, you can play around with this tool and try to see what that will look like. The last bullet point here, and I'll say it as it relates especially to the division of property, is thinking about the fairness of it all. So you want to be looking out for your best interest, but you also need to understand that as part of this process, especially if you're pursuing uncontested divorce, you'll at some point need your spouse to agree to the terms. And so you want to try to find some level of division of finances and assets and debt that feels okay or comfortable for both of you. So that's kind of a goal or theme across a lot of this, is looking for fairness. Okay. Just checking the time. Looks like we're still okay. Moving into another really critical step for those of you who have children is thinking through how to put their best interest at the forefront of all of your plans for divorce. There's a lot of different moving pieces, especially if you have younger children that you need to be considering. For those of you who have adult children, it's a little bit of a different situation. But for anyone who has children who are 18 or under, we definitely want to encourage you to make sure that as you're thinking about this process, that you are thinking about their best interests. That means thinking about when and how you're going to tell them. We've got a great article around that we can share. We also want you to be thinking about different custody types. So another article we can share that reviews the differences between sole custody versus joint custody, as well as common custody schedules. This can change depending on the age of your children. So a resource that we'll share will have different or common schedules that are based on different age ranges. you can imagine that if you have children who are in preschool, what that visitation schedule looks like might be different than if you have teenagers. You need to ultimately determine what is best for your family and your children as you're making these decisions. But sometimes it's just nice to see what options are available or what other people do to help inform what could be right for your family. There's also some considerations around child support. This is very state specific in terms of how these calculations are done. There's many child support calculators online, but really we want to make sure that you're thinking about the needs of your children and financially what that will look like, because that will likely be a part of the filing process as you move forward, and especially if you have minor children, we'll need to be addressing that. And then finally, a detailed parenting plan. We have a checklist for all the different considerations that you should be thinking about as you build a parenting plan. Anything from screenshot here shows living arrangements. So where will your children be living? How will you be transferring them from pickup and drop off? How are you going to be staying in touch regularly? What kind of, phone call cadences or video call cadences are you going to have? All the way to how are you going to handle medical decisions or educational decisions. So it's a pretty extensive list of things to make sure that you at least have a conversation with your co-parent about, and make sure you're on the same page. And then as best you can, try to document that in a parenting plan. So there's a lot to make sure you consider in this process, and we know how important it is to get this right. So please take advantage of the resources that we have available, and make sure that you kind of understand all of your options before you ultimately decide on what's best for you, your family, and your children. Okay, the last step in our getting prepared process is thinking about the negotiation and documentation of these terms. We have mentioned throughout the webinar some of the key decisions that are needed, but I just wanted to make sure it's crystal clear, ultimately where things can potentially come into disagreement, right? Where there would need to be a compromise between you and your spouse, because you'll want to be thinking about your goals for divorce and even what you believe your spouse's goals may be, so that you can come up with a game plan, think about what is necessary for you moving forward and what is just a nice to have, right? This is a mindset approach, thinking about compromise, thinking about negotiation, and the types of things that you'll need to potentially compromise are the division of assets and debt, like we talked about before, thinking through what you're going to do with cars, homes, bank accounts. If you own a business, if you have 401ks, all of that needs to be considered. And potentially there might be some disagreement coming into this approach. What I want to make sure everyone understands is it is still possible to pursue an uncontested divorce if you are not in agreement at the beginning of this. Maybe you and your spouse don't agree on the home. Our service and others that are out there offer mediation. We believe very strongly that mediation is a helpful tool for people to find common ground and do it in a way that causes less conflict and does not cost as much as hiring lawyers and have the lawyers fight it out for you. We also feel like for those of you who use mediation, you'll get through this process in a way that is quicker and less stressful. The aim of mediation is trying to come to an agreement. It's not continuing to fight forever and ever ad infinitum. So we have resources at divorce.com that can help you through our mediation services, and we definitely recommend pursuing something like that if you're currently not in agreement but want to pursue uncontested divorce. Another big potential area of disagreement is on custody and visitation. We had just covered some of those things that you'll need to be considering, whether it's sole custody or joint custody, what your visitation schedule looks like. Is it 7 days, 7 days? Is it 2, 2, 3? Things like that. if there's any disagreement there, or even in terms of like legal custody and who makes the final decisions in all of this. Again, we really advocate for mediation. We feel strongly that mediation will help make sure that it's child-centric in how you're approaching your decision-making process. Make sure you don't lose sight of their best interest and really help you come to common ground and help nurture the co-parenting relationship that will need to continue once you get past the divorce. Finally, the last piece that sometimes comes up in terms of disagreements that needs to be decided on in this process is whether or not there is spousal support, and then what this child support amount will look like if you do have children. There are calculators out there, there are best practices to follow, but as with all things in divorce, there's some level of negotiation that can happen here. And so you'll want to be doing some of that homework that we had talked about before and looking at the financial puzzle to make sure that when you are advocating for your best interest, you're doing it from a place that's prepared and informed. Okay, we will move along. We have a section for Q&A, but before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to just leave some breathing room. The intention of this webinar was really to give you a high level and set expectations, hopefully educate you on some things that you'll need to be considering in the process. We didn't have time in this webinar to open up those resources that we've sent through the chat and really dive in and look at what a parenting plan looks like, or how to really think through building a budget for yourself. So we want to know for future reference if we should potentially put together an interactive workshop and if there's interest there. So if you're interested in exploring a more interactive workshop where we dive into more depth in some of these tools, you can write yes. If not, if you just want to do this on your own time, we totally understand. Everyone has busy schedules. You just want access to the resources, that's fine too. This will just help us make sure that we're giving you the right tools and the right level of support so that you feel good. And it looks like many of you need some more support, which makes sense. I know this can feel overwhelming, and we've thrown a lot of resources at you. So definitely be on the lookout for more information around what an interactive workshop could look like from us. And thank you for participating in that poll. Okay, I am going to try to get to Q&A now. Okay, this is a great question. We have someone asking, do I fill out the forms by hand or do I have to convert them to a fillable PDF? So this may differ depending on how you actually file. If you use a service like divorce.com, we have a state-specific questionnaire that will ask you different questions. You input your answer to the question, and then that populates the forms that are necessary for filing. We believe that this is a very easy to use process. And then what ultimately happens is there's a PDF that will come as a result of that. We will also send you the actual physical form if that's required in your state. And then we have a service as well for filing assistance. There are a lot of nuances in filing. If you're choosing to use a service like ours, we have all the ins and outs and know what exactly is required. Some courts have different restrictions on staples versus paper clips, or the type of ink you use if you are signing your paperwork in a certain ink. So we, we have a variety of different packages at divorce.com to help you get your divorce. Most of them include that filing assistance so that you're able to ultimately get it done correctly with the court and then can move on in your divorce. Okay, we have another question. Can all those resources shared available on your website? Yes, we have the resources on our website. We've got a resource section on the website. The other thing, I vaguely mentioned it at the beginning, but it's worth repeating again. We will be sending a recording of this webinar via email to everyone who attended, and even those of you who had interest and are maybe watching it after the fact. We will also send along all of the resources. Again, we know it's a lot, But the idea is to make sure you have access to these resources so that when you're going through the mindset of, okay, what do I need to do for my children? You know, all the different resources that you should be looking into and educating yourself on. So there's a few different ways. Like I said, the email that will be coming as a follow-up from anyone who had any interest in this webinar. And then, like I said before, on our website, you go to the homepage, there is a resource section. If you drop that down, you can get access to webinars, you can get access to our blog, where a lot of these articles are coming from. There's access to our checklists. We have the document checklist, the parenting plan checklist. So all the things that we referenced are in that section of the website as well. Awesome. Okay, it looks like, oh, I think there are more questions actually. Need to scroll for more information. Okay, another question. Thank you for the overview and links. Very good information to begin my homework. Glad to hear that. You did mention a child support or spousal support calculator. Where could that be located? Right now, we do not have resources on our website for that. That's a quick Google search in your state. So if you live, I live in Virginia. So if you live in Virginia, Virginia Child Support Calculator, you can start getting some sense of what that will look like. If you go through our process, we also have some tips around how to be thinking about this, or if you're in mediation, our mediators will talk through that. But the quickest way to get started, or at least start to think about what the calculations look like for your state, just a simple Google search will get you there. We're working on it though, so I hear that feedback that that's a good resource that would be useful for you. Okay, what else is in here? Okay, another good question. I have gone through the year waiting and I'm ready to finalize a divorce, but I didn't file a year ago. We just separated. Can I file? What's the next step? So without getting into legal advice about your specific situation, what I will say is whenever there is a separation period, the best practice is to wait for that separation period to pass. So if you're in a state where it's a 6-month or a year-long separation period, you separate for that amount of time and then you file. So you can use our service if that's your circumstance. In some instances, if you are in a certain state and you have not met the separation period requirements, our system will let you know that there's some more time that needs to go by for you to be able to meet the requirements in your state. But again, like this is very state specific, so we want to make sure that you do that lookup, understand the separation period requirements, and then once you meet those requirements, then you can file. Okay, another question specifically about our packages at divorce.com. Can you elaborate a bit more on the differences between assisted divorce, we file for you services? Both are for uncontested, so anything that we offer, we are doing so in a way that is uncontested. Even our fully guided divorce, which offers mediation, is getting you to a place where you find that common ground and can ultimately file uncontested divorce. The specific difference between assisted divorce and we file for you service is the addition of a case manager who's dedicated to you. I like to think of a case manager as someone who is there to navigate you to the right next step. So that could look like if you're in the divorce process, through our experience and you're filling out the questionnaire and you have a question, if it's legal in nature, they can help you get to the attorney assistance that we offer. Or if you're realizing that maybe there is a disagreement that you need to have some mediation session for, they can get you set up with mediation. If it's specifically about the process, they're there to answer the questions. They are your assigned and dedicated person to go to ask any questions you have about the process, and they'll make sure that you have the right information or the right resources to go to answer that question and get you moving through the process more quickly. We hear pretty often from people who use a case manager that it was nice to have someone to just, talk to. Sometimes people hire attorneys and tend to use the attorney as a therapist at a very high hourly rate. Our case managers are just part of the package and they're there to listen and guide you. So That is the main difference. The We File For You service effectively gets you the paperwork necessary for the filing process, and then we will actually do the filing assistance through the court. So that means we initiate the case with the court, we'll file the petition on your behalf, we'll get your signature, we'll send out the paperwork to your spouse and collect their signature. And then depending on which state you're on, there's different filing rules and processes, but we know all that information, and the We File For You service is making sure that you know what to do, what is required of you, and in many instances, we take on a lot of that burden for you. In assisted divorce, we do that as well, but the case manager is added on. Okay, another question. If we're filing an uncontested divorce and have no assets together and have agreed to assume our own debts, not split anything, do we still have to collect all of these documents? If you're talking about the gather documents checklist that I referenced, that's super extensive. This is very dependent, one, on your circumstances, like you said, you already know what that is going to look like, and two, your state. So some states have different sections in the forms that are required that will ask for this information, and some states are very straightforward and don't ask a ton of questions about your individual circumstances or assets and debt. So I can't answer your specific question, but I can say, generally speaking, this will be dependent on one, where you live and the forms that are necessary to file and ultimately get all the paperwork done, and then two, what your circumstances are. If you don't have this, if we don't have those assets, they don't exist, then you wouldn't need to be putting that in. Another question on specific residency requirements in certain states. We have that resource for you to look it up. Highly recommend you check that out. You can check both states. If one spouse is in one state, one spouse is in another state, check both of them, see what the requirements are to make sure that you're ultimately meeting them within your state guidance. If both sides are in agreement or are able to agree on everything in divorce, you have to hire a mediator or a lawyer to file. That's part of the reason why we exist. We know that some people, one, don't want to hire a lawyer or feel that they can do this on their own. We feel like a service like ours helps you do that in a very cost-effective way, and you don't need to hire a lawyer. A legal term, it's called a pro se divorce. What that means ultimately is that you're representing yourself and you do not need a lawyer. With that said, we have a network of lawyers that you can access if you have a legal question as you go through this process. We also have mediators if you need to use them to work out your different issues or disagreements. But you do not need to use a lawyer, and you do not need to use a mediator if you're totally in agreement, you know what you're going to be doing. You can use our service, document everything, get it filed, and be through the process without having used one of those two or either of those two types of professionals. Totally dependent. I'm going to broaden this and say, this is very dependent on circumstances for people. So if you need legal advice or if you have those disagreements, these types of resources can be helpful. And we have, obviously, we have mediation available through our package. It's called Fully Guided. We also have a network of attorneys that you can access. So if you are in, if you're thinking about a certain question, maybe about community property rules, and you want to get some guidance there, you can reach out to an attorney, get that question answered, and then use the rest of our services to get through it without having to hire an attorney, rack up a ton of cost, and do the process their way, which tends to take longer, cost more, and often can heighten conflict. So not necessary. Okay. How soon in the process can I secure services with divorce.com. My spouse may not be as ready as I am, but I would like to get started. So we have people who are in a range of different phases of their divorce. You can definitely get started with us today. You'll get access to our questionnaire. That questionnaire will walk you through some of the necessary information that's required for the paperwork and also the decisions like we talked about. You may need at some point to get your spouse involved to figure out the decision piece of it, but you can at least start the process by, writing down your social security number, which is required, or writing down the date of your marriage, things that you know already that aren't something you need to consult your spouse on. And then when you get to the place of having that conversation with your spouse and their readiness is maybe further along, you have a few options. One, you can invite them to our platform and they can have access to the questionnaire and they can help fill things out. We need Social Security for both parties. So sometimes, if you don't know your spouse's Social Security number, that might be a nice way for them to input it. They can have transparency in the process, or some people don't feel comfortable with that. They just have the conversation outside. And then they take the information that they learned from the spouse and input it into the platform. But you can get started today, right? It can take many months for this process to move along. And sometimes that's, waiting for a spouse to get more comfortable with things, but it doesn't need to hold you back on getting started. Okay. Looks like most of these other questions are very specific in nature. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Apologies for not being able to answer the more specific questions. Hopefully we were able to get to a bunch of questions that were relevant to a lot of you. We're very grateful for your time and attendance here. Be on the lookout for that email that I mentioned before that will have the recording of this webinar. It will also have all the resources that we put in the chat. We'll also potentially be looking to do an interactive workshop. So if that was something that you said yes to, maybe we can dive more into the weeds. And we hope that you are doing well. We know that this phase of life is very complicated and very emotional, and we recognize that, and we really appreciate you taking the time to learn more about how to prepare for this process, knowing that it's a difficult time in your life. So appreciate all of you attending and hope that you all have a great evening and will continue to move your divorce process along. Thank you, everyone.